Here's a story. The writer wants to leave his name out of it, his or her name out of it. But here's what they write. This is real interesting. I'm not going to disclose our names because it's not important, but I have a story to tell from 1978. I was 14 years old at the time, and I grew up in the deep woods of the Catskill Mountains. My grandfather's 500-acre farm bordered many square miles of state forest. It was very dense wilderness, and it was dotted with old farms that were abandoned years ago. These details are important to give you an idea of how remote and desolate these woods are. I've spent my whole life hunting, trapping, and fishing those woods. This encounter happened in late October on a clear moonlit night. I was coon hunting with my uncle, who had well-trained coon hounds, and it was quite cold out that night, and so far the dogs were unusually unsuccessful after 2 hours of hunting. Finally, they started barking, and they were hot on a trail. We were a mile from my grandfather's farm when we started in the direction of the dogs barking. They were across the gully and up on the next ridge. My uncle and I were walking up a dirt road that would take us to an old abandoned farmhouse. It was a straight walk down across the gully and up to the ridge where the dogs got that raccoon in a tree, judging by their barks, and they were steady and in one location. By now, it was 2 a.m., and we were 200 yards from the farmhouse. I noticed loud footsteps 100 yards to my right in the woods. I didn't think much of it at first because I figured it was a big deer or a bear. But as we continued up the road, I noticed it getting closer, and I could tell that it was on 2 feet. At first, I thought it was another hunter, but that made no sense because no one hunts late at night in the woods unless they're both raccoon hunting like us. There were no other dogs in the woods, and that's when I noticed the steps were heavy with the crunch of branches. And I asked my uncle if he heard what I did, and he said no, he didn't. Keep in mind, my uncle spent 2 tours in Vietnam. His hearing was bad from all the concussion blasts during the combat. He was a real badass, with many confirmed kills and multiple gun wounds, including hand-to-hand combat knife wounds, so he wasn't afraid of anything. He grew up in these mountains, as did 3 generations of my family. He had a hard time hearing the low-frequency noises like footsteps in the leaves, and he told me it was my imagination getting away from me. I was getting nervous because all we had were 22 rifles and a .22 pistol, which were not powerful enough to put down whatever it was coming toward us. And then I noticed it started to parallel our direction and continued to edge closer to the road. Obviously, it was very close, maybe 30 feet off to our right, when suddenly my uncle put his hand on my chest and he whispered to stop. The steps to our right continued for 2 more steps and then they stopped. My uncle now knew something was definitely there. We took a few more steps and it started following again. And again, my uncle put his arm out to stop us and it took a few more steps before it stopped. I could feel the apprehension from my uncle. It was reasonably lit on the dirt road because of the full moon, but you couldn't see into the woods. My uncle took out his flashlight and shined it into the woods, but they were too dense to see anything. He told me to keep moving, and the thing continued to follow us. By now, I knew my uncle was nervous because it was obvious this thing was bipedal and large. It was now only a few yards away at this point when we reached the old farmhouse, and we quickly got up on the broken-down porch to turn around and confront our stalker. The beast kept coming. Just when it was about to break into the clearing in front of the house, it stopped. We stood there, not knowing what was going to happen next. My uncle shined the flashlight and could vaguely see a large figure just inside the tree line. But we couldn't see any real detail other than it was very dark in color, and it was at least 9 feet tall. It was massive, and there was a musky stench in the air. I could feel for the first time my uncle was actually scared. Then suddenly it started to walk right down through the woods away from the house. We could hear it leaving as it stomped down the hill until we couldn't hear it anymore. And we waited 10 minutes to listen for any other movement, but it remained silent, so we started down the gully to where the dogs were still barking. We made it there with no further sign of that thing that stalked us. We harvested that raccoon and we bagged it and decided to call it a night. I remember those woods were so quiet, like it was devoid of wildlife. The dogs were also acting strange and kept sniffing the air and whining the entire way back to the truck, and I'd never seen them act like that before that night. My uncle sold all of his raccoon dogs shortly after that and didn't hunt at night anymore. When friends and family would ask why, he wouldn't say, only that he wasn't making enough money on the pelts to make it worth his while, which was baloney, because pelts back then on a big raccoon sold for $45 each, more than enough to pursue that hobby. If I ask my uncle what he thought that was that night, he won't talk about it, not even to me, and he rarely hunts even during the daytime now. Neither do I, for that matter. I've seen large footprints in the snow when I was trapping for muskrat a few years earlier, twice the length of my snow boot, so I'm pretty sure what it was that stalked us that night. If that wasn't a Bigfoot, then what else could it be? I've had other encounters. I've smelled him and sensed his presence, but I've never actually seen one clearly. My account of these events are exactly as they happened, and they are completely true. I really appreciate your channel to allow folks to tell their experiences such as mine. I'm glad to know there are many others who have had similar experiences so that I don't feel alone on this subject anymore. And the writer signs off, and that's another raccoon hunting story, you know. You hunt raccoons at night. You can hunt them during the day, and you can probably kill them during the day, but raccoons are primarily nocturnal. They get out and look for food at night. All you got to do is put out a trail cam on a corn feeder, and the raccoons are all over it all night. But I think this story is quite typical for people who are out at night, especially with dogs. Dogs seem to stir these creatures up. And I thought it was interesting. It's not much different than a lot of the raccoon hunting episodes that I've read. However, this thing tracked them back to the old farmhouse, and they could actually see the outline of it in the woods. They couldn't make out any details, but there it was, standing right at the edge of the woods, and they could see it, 9 feet tall. Imagine looking off an old porch and seeing a creature on 2 legs, standing upright like a man, that's 9 frickin' feet tall. Holy moly. All right, thank you to the writer for sending this. Let's move on to another one. Oh yeah, welcome to the Dixiecryptid channel. My name is Cameron Buckner, and all we do here is tell stories. Hey guys, there's some friends of mine who own a soap company. The name of the company is Yeti Bars Soap. They're running an Easter sale right now. And if you hurry and buy something between now and Easter, it's going to qualify you to win a $500 giveaway. It's going to be drawn on Easter, and it's a random drawing. And don't forget to try some of their new soaps. They've got the new Orange Bark Bar, and they've got the Yeti Citrus. All you have to do is go to yetibars.net or Yeti Bars on Facebook and take a look at their whole inventory. And I think you'll find something you like. But I've got a couple of these orange bark bars and the citrus bars, and they really smell good. Use the code DC10 at checkout and get a 10% discount. Can't go wrong. YetiBars.net, Yeti Bars on Facebook. Let's get back into the podcast. All right, here's a short little email I got, but it packs a big punch. The writer is anonymous. It was 7:40 p.m. and we were riding in twilight. It was made darker by the canopy that blotted out what little light was left of the day. I was cycling with some recumbent riders. We got a late start on getting back to our cars, and I was the only one with the headlamp on my bike, so I volunteered to take the lead. We had 2 motor traffic thoroughfares to cross, and I was essentially the crossing guard. No sooner had we entered the dark part of the trail when 20 yards in front of my light beam, something flashed across the trail. At first, I thought it was a deer, and in the same second, I remembered that deer don't have shaggy auburn hair. There was also a silver tuft toward the back of it. I didn't see a head, arms, or feet, and it flashed so quickly from my right to my left that there was no time to register it if I did. We were coming up to our first crossing, so I didn't give it too much thought until 30 seconds later when I heard the distinct whoop coming from the south side of the trail, the same direction that whatever ran in front of me came from. And then I heard an identical whoop, whoop 3 times coming from the north side. These calls came from such a distance that only something with a massive lung capacity could have made them sound so loud. As we came to the first crossing, I had time to let the whole experience play like a movie in my mind. The recumbent riders crossed the road and proceeded to the next segment of the trail, but I asked one of the riders on a conventional bike if he'd heard the whoops. He replied that he had, and he asked me what I thought it was. "Well, I don't know," I said, honestly. And then he went through a whole litany of wildlife that it could possibly have been that made that call, including an elk. The nearest elk inhabits the western United States, 2,400 miles away from New England. I went back a week later and I took pictures where I'd found evidence of habitation. All of this was sent to the local BFRO. An investigator contacted me and interviewed me and then never contacted me again, nor did they ever list the incident on their website. I later tried to contact them again, but to no avail. I can't help but wonder if they were contacted by some authority to scuttle the whole incident. This part of the southern hemisphere in northern Massachusetts is heavily populated. Maybe they thought it might cause some sort of panic. That's my only thoughts, though. And that's the end of the email. And I think that's the way, if people actually get a visual, that's the way they see them. Whew! Right in front of your car or your bike or... y'all know what a recumbent bike is? It's one of those bikes that you lay on your back and ride. Some of them are two-wheelers and some of them have three-wheel. They're trikes. They're really cool. I actually test rode one. I was in Nashville 2 or 3 years ago and I just stopped by a bike shop. I had some time to kill. And they had some of these recumbent bikes in there and I got in it and rode it around the parking lot. They're really cool. I almost decided to buy one, but I thought, no, I kind of like riding upright. But anyway, I'm going off on a tangent, but I think that's the way a lot of people see these creatures, just in a flash across the road or, just a quick image off in the woods and then it's gone. It's real interesting. And regarding the BFRO, I know some people bash them, but I don't ever do that because I don't know anything about them. But I will say this, normally when there's a bad rap on some organization or there's a lot of blabber about some organization, it's usually instigated by some YouTube channel or some website, and sometimes it's not true. The BFRO has a great website. That's really the only thing I know about them. But you can go, if you're interested in Bigfoot encounters that you like to read, go to the BFRO website. There are thousands of encounters on there. Matter of fact, a lot of the people who read these in YouTube channels, they just rip them off the BFRO and they narrate them on their channel. I don't do that, but and I guess that's cool. It's not a big deal. And organizations, they can't, just me. I'm little old me. I'm just little old Dixiecryptid YouTube channel, and I get hundreds of encounter stories, people who have actually claimed to have seen or encountered these things in some way. Imagine what a big famous organization like the BFRO gets. Probably hundreds of thousands. It's probably hard to get local investigators that, those guys do that just as a sideline. It's probably hard to get them to go out and pay real close attention to every single report they get. And I think they're probably doing the best they can. I'm not taking up for them. Again, I don't know anything about them. Nothing. I don't know anybody involved with the BFRO. All I know is that there's a lot of chatter out there on YouTube about what a horrible organization they are. All I'm saying is Just because somebody says it doesn't necessarily mean it's true. Just keep that in mind. All right, let's go to another story. Okay, y'all, it's a beautiful Sunday afternoon, and I'm about to read this story, and my dog just shit the floor. In my office here, she's got runny poops, so if you hear me, just ignore it. It smells horrible in here. Plus, I've got about 15 hens on my porch. I have my door open, so you may hear some noise from them. I don't know. None of this means anything, but I'm just letting you know what I go through to get these stories out. Plus, it's a beautiful day, and I need to be outside working in my yard so my wife won't be mad at me. But I'm in here doing this because I really want to get a podcast out this afternoon. Somebody pat me on the back and say, it'll be okay, Cam. It'll be okay. Just read the story. Let's just do that. The writer on this story, again, wants to be anonymous. And here's what he writes. This happened in late July, just after they cut the hay, and the round bales had been taken and there was a short grass. It's an excellent opportunity to shoot coyotes. My dog was lying a few yards away from me in a mowed down path to the creek. She was lying in my overgrown food plot. The Johnson grass had since taken over and it was a good 6 feet tall. While she slept, I was watching the hayfield from my side-by-side, and I had my 10-22 with me with a full magazine. I've had that 22 since I was 14. Most folks don't think a 22 is a good weapon for taking coyotes, but it shot straight, and I've taken coyotes with it in the past. It was late in the evening, and the sun had gone down, but I could still see. My dog woke up and started turning circles and barking and looking straight up into the trees. Her head was twisting and turning as she looked up, and then I heard growls and foot stomping and the trees moving 10 feet up. I stood up to yell at my dog to quit and hit the horn in the process, which added to the confusion. "Knock it off," I yelled at her, and in response she took off for the house. Well, I yelled at her again as she passed me to cross the creek. And I think if dogs could talk, I'm guessing by the look on her face, she would have said, "Screw you, buddy, I'm out of here." So I sat back down and I tried to regain my composure. I was there for a long time watching the trees and trying to see what she saw. And whatever it was never made another sound or appearance. It was getting even darker out, so I started up my side-by-side and headed across the creek. "Patience is a virtue," I yelled back over my shoulder to the thing in the trees, and then I gave my side-by-side all the gas it would take and I headed for home. My bird dog was sitting on the porch, shivering and waiting for me when I got there, and for the next couple of weeks, me and the dog would go back down to the other side of the creek to watch the hayfield for coyotes. She wouldn't lie down at the other end of the trail anymore. Instead, she'd lie behind me at the crossing point where she'd slept until the sun started getting low. Every time we had an encounter, she would wake up, raise her head and sniff the air and run like hell for the house. After she would leave and it was dark, branches would start breaking on the creek behind me. I took my brother-in-law down there once to experience it, and we heard what sounded like rocks clacking or teeth clashing together, and it sounded like it was 40 or 50 yards away. The last time it happened, I put my dog in the side-by-side with me and I headed down there, and I parked where I always did, away from the creek facing the hayfield. I wouldn't let her get out. And as it got dark, she raised her nose and then tried to bust out of the side-by-side, and I grabbed a patch of hair and held on to her for as long as I could. "You're not leaving me alone out here again," I said, as I struggled to keep her in place. She kept fighting me until I had to let go, and I was afraid if I didn't, she'd get out anyway, and I'd be left with just a patch of hair and skin in my hands. She was fighting that hard, and she ran like the devil across the creek and headed straight back to the house. I stayed down there as long as I could. Branches were breaking up and down the creek behind me. The rock clashing didn't happen this time, but I was done anyway. I got the buggy across the creek and I raced home. My dog was waiting on the porch for me as usual, shivering. Another 2 weeks of this, and the grass was getting tall again, and the encounters stopped. I got on the internet and I started listening to stories. Things in the past started to make sense to me, and I remembered years ago walking down there and movement caught my eye on the creek bank. I thought I saw a small monkey climbing the bank with its arms and legs, heading for the Johnson grass to find cover. I went across to where it came out, but I didn't find anything, so I wrote it off as my eyes playing tricks on me. That's just one of the many strange occurrences I've had along that creek. I don't think they're mean or want to hurt me. They've had too many opportunities to do me in if they wanted to. Okay, that was pretty good. That was a good story. The last podcast I did had 2 stories in it about people who had feelings. They sensed something around them. And I guess that's a few people who commented in the comment section were, those feelings are valid. When you feel those feelings, you need to get out of there. Maybe so, maybe not. I don't really trust my feelings. That's just me. I kind of trust what I can see and what I don't see. But back to this story, this man never saw anything. When he was younger, he did see a monkey, something that looked like a monkey, going over the bank. But, what could that have been? Could it have been a dog? I'm just playing devil's advocate here because I think this makes him real nervous when he goes out. And if you ever hear me talk about these things, I really want to encourage people not to be afraid to go in the woods. There's really nothing to be afraid of. And the reason I say that is, of all the hundreds of Bigfoot encounters that I've gotten, nobody ever gets hurt. Nobody gets hurt. We had one story where a guy wrote in and he claims a Bigfoot killed his grandfather. I think it's like the 5th or 6th video I ever did. But other than that, not only do they not get killed or taken, they don't get hurt. So, and I know there's people out there who will go, well, if you get taken, there's no one there to write the story. And you've got a point there, but I just don't think people should be afraid to go in the woods. I know that's going to make a lot of people mad, but it's my position. And I respect your position if you think they shouldn't, and I want you to respect mine when I think they should go in the woods, because it's a wonderful place to be, to go out in the wilderness, especially alone. And you don't have to go into these wildernesses that are 50 miles away from everything. Just walk out in the woods, find some place, a state park or something. Walk around trails, walk in the woods. It really is a good experience. So, okay, well, that's my pitch for going in the woods. But be careful and be alert when you're there. There's snakes, and depending on where you are, there are predators in the North American woods. Not where I live, but they are there. Enjoy the woods. That's all I'm saying. All right, let's go to one more story. Okay, this next story, I'm going to leave, the writer doesn't say, but I'm going to leave his name anonymous anyway. And he claims this story is true. This is a whopper right here. Again, all these stories that I read, I have no idea if they're true or not, but it's the way people send them to me. Well, I can't assume anything, so I don't. I don't assume anything. But I make a judgment on those just like you do, but I'm just not going to say what I think. Does that make sense? Hope that makes sense. All I do is read them. That's all we do is just read these stories. And it's up to you to decide whether you believe them or not. Back in the 1970s, when we heard whoops and knocking across the lake from the cabin my family owned, we were told it was drunk hippies. It was, after all, Northern California in the 1970s. We lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, but we were in the Sierras year-round. My family owned a cabin at 6,000 feet elevation in Pinecrest off of Highway 108. We skied in the winter and enjoyed the lake in the spring and summer, and we hunted deer and cut wood from fall back into winter. After high school in 1984, I moved up to our cabin to get away from the city. The work was seasonal, and during the winter months, we worked the local ski resort, and then from May to October, we were wildland firefighters in the Stanislaus National Forest. I think that's how you pronounce that. Stanislaus Stanislaus National Forest. And he says it all sounds great when you're 19. The first year with the U.S. Forest Service Department of Agriculture was 1985. I won the job of lead sawyer on a 30-man team. We were a hand crew who went where bulldozers and trucks couldn't go, either by humping in or by helicopter. Usually, wilderness areas have never been logged and therefore they have no fire roads. The area of my forest, the Stanislaus National Forest, occupies and contains the immigrant wilderness where Ron Moorhead recorded the Sierra Sounds. The first of my 3 encounters occurred a few hours to the north of the Plumas National Forest, in which the town of Quincy is located. The main fire camp was at the local fairgrounds where the different teams from around the country gathered to organize for the fight. Our team drew a heli-tac mission several miles beyond any type of road into an old-growth wilderness area, and that meant we would be dropped in by helicopter. We split the team to fight 2 separate dry lightning strikes, each about an acre. It takes 4 trips to ferry the entire team. Being the lead sawyer, I was always in the first flight with one of my crew leaders to assess the approach and fell any trees that needed to create rotor clearance. Sometimes that meant rappelling down and lowering my saw by rope. I fell 2 trees and the landing zone was open. John, my crew leader, the First Nations Miwok tribe member, and I started to establish the approach by tying ribbons and limbing up trees so the remainder of the crew could easily follow. It was an easy fire. Half the crew had ours out and coal before total dark. The plan was to bivouac and keep an eye on the burn until the morning when the birds would pick us up. It was a beautiful area with old-growth forest and barely any moonlight reaching through the forest floor. We each took out our space blankets and found a good tree to bed up against. We were exhausted and we fell asleep in no time. It was 3:30 a.m. when I suddenly awoke and found myself staring at the outline of an 8 to 9 foot tall creature covered in dark hair. I could see it move as he was swaying. Years of hunting all over the Sierra Nevada mountains told me that this was not a bear, and I started to reach for my chainsaw, but I couldn't move. It felt like I was being held on every part of my body, and I was furious. I wanted to cut this thing off at the knees, and that's when he turned and looked at me with, I swear to God, red glowing eyes. I was never scared. I was too angry to be afraid. I was mentally yelling to the big bully to let me go and give me a shot. He looked at me as an older man would at a 19-year-old, and as clear as day, without making an audible sound, he said, "Thank you for taking care of our home. You are our friend." Well, I immediately felt calm, and we stared at each other for a long minute or two. He had a human face with only a beard for facial hair. He was 4 feet wide at the shoulders, and his hair hid any neck that he might have had, and his nose was turned down, almost human-like. His arms were long, with hands that hung down below his knees, and his chest was ripped. I knew the chainsaw would have been a bad idea. He was definitely a male, and he was standing a mere 4 feet from me, and he could have reached out and grabbed me at any moment. I started to listen with my ears. Everyone was snoring and making normal sleeping sounds. I looked back at him and he honestly gave me a polite nod, and then he turned and took 3 or 4 easy steps that made no sound and carried him in an unreasonable distance to where he passed between 2 trees. At that point, he just vanished. Where he had been looked like the transporter sparkles from a Star Trek episode. I'm no kidding. It was like beam me up Scotty type stuff. And then it was dead quiet. And the guy sleeping 4 feet away started whimpering quietly, and the guy next to him made a sound like he was soiling his pants. Well, I stayed quiet until the sky turned purple in the east before I finally got off to relieve myself. I turned when I was done, and I saw John, my crew boss, standing right behind me. He was looking at me with a serious expression on his face. Who else, was all he said. Later, I told 2 other guys in my crew about the incident, and this is where the Bigfoot and the government messed with my life and my freedoms. I was sternly ordered to go get the other 2 guys and bring them back to that spot while the rest of the crew was sent to prep the LZ for the choppers. John, my boss, held up his hand and he walked back to us and he told us not to speak. And then he advised us that as employees of the federal government, we now had top secret clearances and we were never to speak to anyone of the bear encounter, not even amongst ourselves. I begged him to answer just one question from each of us. He gave me a disappointed look and he walked away to meet the others at the chopper. While the 3 of us made our way to the meadow, I tried to speak with my teammates, but to no avail. They were both clearly in shock and would not utter a word. We made the chopper ride back to town, where we each met individually with top FS brass, I don't know what FS, Forestry Service brass. After a lengthy debriefing and some scary warnings, I headed for the showers and then I went to chow. I was told that both of my team members were sick and had been sent home due to smoke inhalation. I made the decision then to shut up. Leavenworth Supermax didn't sound too inviting to me. And when we left Quincy, we traveled back to our forest to work and wait for the next fire call. And I did my best to act normal, but I felt like everyone knew my secret. It was a long time before I was able to relax in my own skin again. During the mid-season, we were called to go a couple of hours south to the Sierra National Forest east of Fresno near Sequoia and Yosemite National Park. The fire was slow-moving, so John and I hiked up a ridge across the canyon from the burn that was slowly moving up the opposite ridge through a stand of trees. Along the other ridge was a logged area that ran to the top with a stand of trees that ran along to its left. And standing in the middle of the logged area, about halfway up the ridge, was an 8 to 9 foot reddish-brown Bigfoot, or this guy writes Sabe. I don't know where that word came from. It's pretty new. People are using it all over YouTube, but we'll call him Sabe, whatever. It was standing there assessing the fire just as we were. All I could think about was how the bully held me down with his freeze-ray eyes the last time we met, and I put as much concern into broadcasting one very clear message to this bastard, and it was 2 words, but I don't want to repeat them here. We were at least 450 yards in a tree line across the canyon, but he looked directly at me. He gave me a slight wave by raising his hand and took another look at the fire, and then he turned toward the opposite stand of trees and, wow. He covered the 300-yard side hill to the opposite stand of trees in a time and speed that was not physically possible by the physics that we understand right now. The weirdest part was that he looked like he was gliding. Each stride covered huge distances, and then, just like before, he passed into a tree line and vanished, and he was followed by 2 softball-sized orbs. It was midday and very clear with all the smoke traveling up over the other ridge. Well, I turned and looked at John, and he smiled at me and he said, "What did you think of that bear?" It didn't mind speak to us so much as it sent an emphatic, thankful feeling, and I wouldn't want to be on this giant's bad side. Nothing was said between John and me, but again, it didn't frighten me nearly as much as it amazed me and made me angry at the jerks who had been letting me run around this forest since I was 5 years old without telling me that the boogeyman was real. The last time I had occasion to work with our fellow protectors happened midway through my second fire season. We were dispatched to Yosemite, which shares a border with our home forest. We grouped at the top of the glacier point at the ski area for helicopter operations, and being in the first sortie, I got a great ride. We dropped over Glacier Point and went straight toward the valley floor. The pilot pulled level at 500 feet and banked off El Capitan and then circled toward Bridal Veil Falls where the fire was located. On this fire, I had to rappel down and have my saw lowered. And the boss made a couple of sweeps while I was felling 3 trees, giving us the clearance for the rotors. I had already started to move up the slope toward the fire, tying ribbons and limbing trees, and as I came over a rise, another sabe was standing 20 feet away. Well, I started to laugh at the silly smile on its face. He in some way communicated that I met his kin and that I was welcome. He had me follow him up a route I never would have seen otherwise. I was in a perfect spot to start the initial attack on the burn line. The crew followed my trail up, and John came over to me and he said, "You gotta love these bears, huh?" Well, those are the official and unofficial encounters that I'm officially not supposed to talk about. Thank you and the other brave souls who gave me the courage to right the wrongs that I can. And that's the end of his email. And I'm not sure, I didn't read any wrongs in this email, but I think there are many who are going to find this type of encounter quite outlandish. You know, I think this is like putting magical powers on these Bigfoot. That's not me. I thought the story was great. I'm not saying that. But I bet there are some, if I'm right, there are some out there who are going to go, oh, this is kind of a crazy story. But this guy obviously sounds like he knows about fire jumping and firefighting in the national forests. And these guys are rawhide dudes. They don't play around. They're in fantastic shape. They eat good. They exercise all the time. And when they're fighting fires, they're out there for days without sleep. I read a book not too long ago. Well, it was actually 10 or 15 years ago by Norman MacLean. I think it was called Young Men and Fire. It was about the Man Gulch fire. I can't remember. Maybe it was in the 60s. Maybe 8 or 10 firefighters died fighting that fire, and they learned a lot from it. It's a great book. Norman MacLean wrote the book A River Runs Through It that was later turned into a movie with Brad Pitt and some other guys, and it's a good movie. But the book is better. But he wrote a piece of A River Runs Through It is fiction, but he wrote a piece of nonfiction called Young Men and Fire. I strongly recommend you read that book. Norman MacLean was a fantastic writer. He was a very smart, scholarly writer, and when you can read stuff like that, you really learn something. So, I don't know, I'm just rambling about stuff that came to my memory as I was reading this, and these firefighters have always impressed me. You know, the kind of work they do and the things they're willing to do to fight these fires. I think they're in it for the adventure. But to run into a Bigfoot out in the middle of the woods and him do mind speak with you, you see orbs are involved. There is no aggressive feelings or any fear of these things. They according to this Bigfoot, or Sabe as he called it, seems to mind speak with him to calm him. Isn't that cool? I think that's really cool. Well, thanks to the writer for the story. I thought it was great. That's going to wind up this podcast. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll see you guys on the next one. I sure appreciate you. Thanks.